Tom, thank you so much for being with us today. I know it's your field and your passionate concern. I wish it didn't have to be. I wish this were a horror of the past, and it isn't, is it? We're living it even today in the 21st century already.
I would say it's increasing even.
Geez.
If you look at an arc of history in the major genocides, the trajectory is that it's increasing, not decreasing.
You know, I know I know it seems like a silly thing to say, and it is, but it's not entirely silly to notice that the wonderful, and while I'm critical of all science and technology, with the wonderful developments in science and technology and what we're doing morally isn't keeping up with those. And so our relationships to science and technology are dehumanizing us and heading us down paths that are not improving our moral sensibilities, but blocking them. And that just makes me crazy sometimes.
Yeah, that's the key word. There's dehumanization, and then ancillary to that, it is all about dehumanization. But I think that when I study this and I think about like what is changing, like why is this happening? I point to population growth. That we wouldn't be doing this to people that we're looking at, right? Like if there's a car accident, we all pull over to the side of the road, if everything's safe, you know what I mean? Like, when a house is on fire, we don't stop and ask what race, religion, gender, sexual orientation the people in the house are. So what is it about that disconnect that comes from population growth combined with historical reasons of scarcity of resources and propaganda with dehumanization? But it does seem that it's to what you said about technology. I mean, it's the fact that it's the living and the killing version of social media, isn't it? That we can attack people that we don't see.
Yes, thank you for saying that, because one of my great concerns about cyberspace, which is a term we don't seem to use anymore. I guess it's out of fashion. Maybe it'll come back, because we need a way of identifying that space in which we objectify each other to the degree that you just described, in my opinion, Tom. And it's really frightening to me. And I think it happens on our cell phones, and it happens certainly on the internet. And those two, of course, are related. That really concerns some of us, and because it's happening under the conditions of such what's the word I want? Convenience. Our technologies today, it seems to me, are approved on the basis of one, profitability, and number two, convenience. And neither of those are morally concerned. Neither of those have moral focus.
And when we look at the history of genocides, who's controlling the information, to use your example of social media, right? That in every genocide, there's a power differential as well. And so, and normally it's a majority versus a minority, but that's not necessarily true either, because you could have power even if you're in the minority. And so we can see how information is manipulated. It's one of the stages of genocide. I'm fascinated by identity construction, how we perceive ourselves and then how we perceive others, and the assumptions that go into that, latent assumptions in particular. And so, if we just even look at demographics, and demographics is not the be all end all, but if we talk about like the big six in terms of demographics that are ways that we define ourselves or define others, I would say race, ethnicity, religion, nationality, gender, and orientation. To me are the big six. And I think in the United States in particular, we really don't understand the difference between ethnicity and nationality. You know, if you ask somebody what their nationality is, they'll probably tell you that they're Irish and Erin go bra and let's get drunk on St. Patrick's Day. But the predominant people in the United States are the nationality is American. Nationality is your citizenship. It's where you can vote. Your ethnicity is what people are talking about when they're talking about being Irish and so forth. So I think like I'll start by just, saying, I personally, I'm Caucasian, I'm Irish, Hungarian, and English are my ethnicities. My nationality is American. I was raised Catholic, and I'm heterosexual, and I'm male. Okay, so so let me ask you guys this question now. You guys want the hard question first. I know I want the hard question. So you got the hardest question, right? The people who live in the United States, what nationality are most of those people that live in the United States? Are all people that are in the United States Americans? No, there could be undocumented people. There could be tourists. There could be foreign students. There could be ambassadors, right? The businessmen and women, like there are all kinds of people who are in the United States that aren't Americans, right? When we talk about race, we're talking usually about Caucasian, East Asian, and Sub-Saharan African. So given those choices, what would you say the dominant group in the United States is?
Caucasian.
Caucasian. So most Americans are American. Most Americans are Caucasian. Most Americans are, what do you want to say for sexuality, anybody?
Heterosexual.
Heterosexual. And here's an interesting one. What gender are most Americans?
Male.
So it's like 0.01 more. Most Americans are women. Most Americans are Caucasian. Most Americans are American, and most Americans are straight. Last question. This is the hard one. So I'll give it to your professor to take a swing at if you'd like to watch him squirm. Nick, and I don't know if we've talked about this before. Do you have any idea? And I know this is a hard question. Nick, do you have any idea what most Americans' ethnic background is? If you were to choose one ethnicity? And this is a hard question. I apologize for putting you on the spot, but I didn't want to put the students on the spot.
Let's see. When we use the word ethnicity, are we referring to race?
No, we're talking about a demographic of race. And so for people from European backgrounds, it's basically the homogenous group from the country in Europe that your ancestors came from. So in your case, Nick, I know that some of your ancestors were Italian. So your ethnicity is Italian. Based on your last name, you probably have other ethnicities besides Italian, but that's what I'm talking about, like a tribal designation or a European nation state.
Well, from my little knowledge of history, Tom, it used to be predominantly sort of Northern European.
Correct.
And that began to change.
It has not changed.
It has not changed.
So like the numbers are moving,
Okay.
but there have only been there have only been 3 dominant ethnic groups in American history. So with all of the millions and millions of indigenous people and immigrants, there's only been 3 dominant groups, the original one being indigenous, right? And then the first group to come and dominate what is now the United States, like if you think about 1776, right? Most Americans in 1776 would have been what?
British.
British, okay. And then it changed in the mid to late 1800s, and it hasn't changed since. The same ethnic group that was the majority ethnic group in the late 1800s is still the majority ethnic group today in 2021. And nobody, by the way, I've asked this question for about 20 years, and I think I've gotten the answer right once from somebody that I asked cold. So you don't, nobody has to feel bad, except for Nick. You can feel bad, Nick.
Thank you.
It's German. Most Americans are German.
No kidding.
Yeah, but you wouldn't know it because since World War I and then World War II, you don't see a lot of Americans running around waving German flags and saying, I'm German, I'm better than everybody else. But like, seriously, if you see how obnoxious Irish people are on St. Patrick's Day, how obnoxious Italians are on St. Joseph's Day, how obnoxious pretend Mexicans are on Cinco de Mayo Day, could you imagine if German Americans acted that way? The knee-jerk reaction would be what? You're a Nazi, right? So here's the point of this lesson, okay? Most Americans are Caucasian, German, Christian, straight, and female, okay? With the exception of female, those other groups are dominant groups politically and economically, as well as demographically. And here's what's important, okay? The more you are the person I just described, right? If there's somebody in this room who is white, female, German, straight, and Christian, the more you probably are wondering what the hell we're talking about and why, and this is stupid. But if anybody, the more distinct you are from that average, the more you're probably thinking to yourself, no shit, yeah, I live this every day. I don't need you to tell me. Do you think that a Muslim American is aware that they're Muslim pretty often? Black Americans are aware that they're Black.
Yes.
Hey, Jesus, did you know you're Mexican?
Wait, what? Since when?
Yeah, I know, right? And if you're not cis-binary, how aware do you think you are on a lived day that most people are straight? You see my point? This is the underlying feature of identity construction, both positive and negative, that becomes othering, which then leads to dehumanization. Whether that dehumanization is racially based, if you think about slavery, if you want to say it's ethnically based, if you want to talk about the indigenous genocides, or if you want to talk about, I remember Hurricane Katrina, there were people saying on TV that Hurricane Katrina happened because of gays. That becomes this othering that leads to dehumanization and then persecution. Now, let's pause that part of the conversation and take about 10 steps backwards. And for the next, until I say uncle, nobody's allowed to say anything about Germans, Jews, Nazis, Hitler, Himmler, Anne Frank, and concentration camps, okay? Not allowed to say anything. All right, so let me ask you, what is genocide?
Is it the attempt to eliminate one group of people?
Okay, what I heard in that answer was attempt. I thought that was an interesting word, and to eliminate in a group of people. That's good. Okay, what's genocide mean to you?
Genocide is the mass murder of a specific group of people.
Okay. Double or nothing. Ready?
Ready.
What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with that?
Yeah, I mean, because when I hear people talk about genocide, they're usually it's a bad thing, right? But I guess when I'm just kind of wondering, why is it bad?
I mean, most people's thought process is Like you shouldn't murder people for just being who they are,
We're-
or existing in whatever way that they are.
Are you crazy? Like, I mean, what are you talking about? Like, where are you getting these ideas about we shouldn't kill people? Where does that come from?
Yeah, I mean that's just general society. That's like the morals we teach. So
Maybe.
Can I
Maybe.
read you guys something? I
Yeah.
promise I won't be too boring.
Go for it.
All right. Quote, but all the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord. So the people shouted and the priests blew their trumpets. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with great joy, and the wall fell flat. So that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. They utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Joshua chapter 6, verses 19 to 21. Anybody know where that story, anybody ever hear that story before?
Yes.
The falling of the walls of Jericho. And yet, if I had pushed you further on where you got this crazy nonsense about thou shalt not kill, you might have even said something like the Bible, right? So
Yeah,
the very
I mean, that's
book that
generally
has
it.
the rules, thou shalt not kill, is the same book that, based on definition of genocide, tell me that the sacking of Jericho wasn't a genocide.
Well, it was.
So then there's nothing wrong with it then, because it's in the Bible.
I disagree so wholeheartedly with that, but I am not a religious person, so
It's all right. We're just having fun.
yeah.
So
That, excuse me,
go for
if I
it.
could just interject, that was just so interesting. She just identified as not a religious person, which is, in terms of power structures, very significant, because what she's saying is she's not going to give power to a religious context. And of course, Tom, the text that Tom just read, is definitely a religious context. So she, for one thing, is not going to be able to justify killing within a religious context. She's going to stick with some other form of moral reasoning. Go ahead, please go ahead.
So does anybody remember who the Romans overthrew in order to become powerful? Who ruled Italy before the Romans? Does anybody know? If you don't, I can tell you, it's not a big deal. The original people on the Italian peninsula that were the power group, that they had actually conquered Rome and that Rome overthrew them, are called the Etruscans. Okay. Has anybody ever met an Etruscan?
No.
Yeah, they're dead. Okay. From a cultural and sense, if not biological. How about this? It's one of the great battles of the ancient world in the Mediterranean. Almost, like I remember I used to teach sixth grade, and sixth graders would know this general. So I'm guessing a few of you would remember him as well. Does anybody remember whose army was made up of war elephants? And it's not Lord of the Rings, by the way. Whose army was made up of war elephants, and he marched them through the Alps, through the snow?
Is that Hannibal or somebody?
Hannibal. Yeah. So this great general Hannibal, who the Romans fought two major wars against, the Second Punic War and the Third Punic War. And the final battle is the Battle of Zama, modern day Tunisia, and the city of Tunis. Does anybody know what happens at the Battle of Zama?
No.
Okay, the guy's name, the winning general's name, you know, when you translate it, when you say them in the original Latin, they sound so stupid. But his name was Scipio. I can't believe like you're supposed to be afraid of a guy named Skippy. But anyways, the General Scipio defeated the great General Hannibal. And they sacked the city of Carthage after they won on the battle on the fields of Zama. And they threw these great hooks on the walls and they pulled the walls down. They fired the city. They went through and enslaved the children, raped the women, and murdered the men. And here is what they famously did. There's some people who say maybe it was more of an exaggeration. It didn't really happen. But let me tell you, even if a part of this is true, this is pretty powerful. The Roman soldiers then went to the ocean and they got large vats and they boiled the ocean, which gave them what? What happens if you boil the ocean?
Salt.
They got salt. And they took those enslaved men from the city of Carthage and they made them plow salt into the fields all around the city of Carthage. Brian, what does that do to your capacity to grow food?
Destroys it.
Yeah.
So Rome destroyed the city, raped the women, enslaved the children, murdered the men, and salted the fields of Carthage. Is that a genocide?
Yes.
Sounds like it.
Is it bad?
It depends. And isn't that sad to be?
Why? What's the variable there, Nick?
One's possible or potential source of justification. It's real easy to do that.
It goes even further, Nick. It goes to what you were talking about at the beginning of class. What is the difference between Rome versus Carthage, Hebrews versus Canaanites, and I'm going to break my own rule, Nazis versus Jews? What is the difference in those between Roman Carthage, Jericho, and Cana here, and Nazis and Jews here?
Who holds the power?
It's about power. There's a more of a power discrepancy in what we call genocide. Most people would not call the sacking of Jericho a genocide. Most people wouldn't call the sacking of Carthage a genocide because, in particular, let's use Carthage. What would have happened if Hannibal had gotten his hands on the city of Rome?
He probably would have done the same thing.
Would have done the same thing. There is a survival aspect as well as a power differential or a closer power differential that makes that different, even though it's still the mass killing of a group of people. So there are other variables. And how about this? I don't know if you ever heard this before. Do you know you don't have to kill somebody to commit genocide? Brian, you're nodding your head. What else is a definition of genocide?
Well, it's just the death of an idea and a culture, right? Or what makes that person what they are.
Yeah, you're spot on. Although I'm going to ask you for specifics just because there are 5 definitions of genocide. So like when you say the death of a culture or an individual or the destruction or however you phrased it, what might that be besides death?
For example, Christianity's turn in Rome, then also deeming every other religion sacrilege, blasphemy, and then killing all of those,
But now you're killing again. So you have to not kill. What's a non-killing form of genocide?
Outlawing.
Okay, so legal persecution, especially if it's systematic. Yep. Anybody know can anybody, I should have asked this already, but I'll ask it now. Can anybody name a genocide that's not involving Nazis or Jews?
The Armenian genocide.
The Armenian genocide. What else, Brian?
Oh, I took part in it, what we're doing in the Middle East.
Native Americans.
Native Americans. Josie, thank you. So there's 6
Muslims
major.
and
I'm sorry?
I was just gonna say the Muslims in, is it China or?
Yeah, there's actually two Muslim genocides going on right now. The Han Chinese are starting a genocide against the Uyghurs in Western China. And in Burma, there is a genocide going on against the Rohingya people who are practicing Muslims as well. But don't worry, nobody cares, and the world's moving on because we say we care, but then we don't do anything, right? There are 6 major genocides of the 20th and 21st centuries. The major ones are the Armenian genocide, what I call the German genocide for intentional reasons, the Cambodian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, the Bosnian genocide, and the Darfur genocide. Those are considered to be the big 6, but there are many, many more. But when so you had mentioned the Armenian genocide. Do you know any details about it by any chance, or how the people were killed? Or
I've learned about it. Don't remember any of it. I like Armenian string cheese. That's
almost like the same thing.
yeah, that's totally the same thing. That's all I've got.
Think about what the U.S. government and Europeans did to indigenous Americans. What's maybe the biggest worst thing we did, or what comes to mind?
We also took a lot of their land, and they're become, I don't know what the word is, displaced and bunched together in little areas of the world, not in the world, in our country, but I know that's not genocide, but
I think you're selling yourself short. It could be, but when you talk about the displacement of Native Americans, what's the largest displacement of Native Americans?
Like, where are they located?
No, what's the event in American history? It's 1828 is the year it happened. And it was a specific event where we displaced a lot of Native Americans.
That Trail of Tears.
Exactamungo. So that's one of the ways that genocide was perpetrated against the Armenians as well. So one of the definitions of genocide is forced migration, okay, or deportation or displacement. So the displacement of Armenians as well as the murder, and the displacement of Native Americans. In fact, let me pull up slides. So I was kicking around what I want to talk to you about today, and I was thinking about what is genocide, and we started talking about those definitions, and I was trying to get at the fact that it's more than just the killing. Yes, I mean you could say that Jericho might be a genocide, and I gave a reason why you could also say it's not. And I mentioned again the Etruscans and Carthage. I didn't mention the Picts, who were the original inhabitants of Scotland. They don't exist anymore. Was that a genocide? People generally would say no. And in addition to the big 6, which I think are on the next slide, there's all kinds of other genocides that have happened over time, and you'll notice that most of them are within the last 100 or years or so. Look at what happened to the Aboriginal people of Australia. Look at apartheid, the Holodomor in the Ukraine, the Mayan Guatemalans from the 1960s through the 1980s, Tibet. The tensions between Muslims and Hindus in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Arab-Israeli conflict, specifically the situation for Palestinians. We have all of these examples of modern genocide, although a lot of these things people shy away from using the word genocide. The word genocide is usually restricted to, as I said, these 6 major ones. And maybe what's going on with not maybe, what is going on with the Rohingya is definitely a genocide. People are less apt to call what's happening to the Uyghur people a genocide. They say it's leading to genocide, or it looks like the beginnings of genocide. And that's predicated, again, on that misunderstanding of what definitions there are for genocide. The highest government body in the world is the United Nations. This is the United Nations definition. And since there are 194 countries in the world, and there are 196, check that, and 194 of the 196 countries that are in the world are signed charter members to the United Nations, that means 194 countries agree legally that this is the definition of genocide. So the definition, yes, letter A there, is the killing of a people of a group. That group could be a national group, an ethnic group, a racial group, or a religious group. We talked about the big six. Notice that they're not including in that list gender or sexuality. This definition was written in the 1940s. It's possible that gender and sexuality would be included in if they were to update the definition. I suspect strongly, like when you look at, for example, in the Horn of Africa and the female castration rituals and so forth. Like, I think that we definitely would include it as in terms of dehumanization, and people under US law can seek asylum over it. So having said that, causing serious bodily harm to members of the group. I just used female mutilation as an example of bodily harm, although it would not count because gender was not identified in the first part of the definition. Part 3, deliberately inflicting conditions calculated to bring physical destruction. So when you look at, like, for example, there used to be a communist party in Ethiopia known as the Derg. Nick, you and I remember the Ethiopian famines of the 1980s, but one of the things that wasn't well documented is that the people who died in the Ethiopian famine didn't live in the famine-stricken area. The Derg moved them, forced migration, moved them to a part of the country of Ethiopia that was having a drought and therefore had a famine and starvation. So they were deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring the physical destruction of a group in whole or in part. Imposing birth preventions. And I would include this, and since the Bosnian genocide, it's been included in case law, is rape. When we look at what the Serbians were doing during the Bosnian genocide, and Croatians as well, of course, but primarily the Serbians, by using rape as a tool of war, what they were doing is destroying the ethnic homogeneousness of the Bosnian people. And then the last one, letter E, again, think of the Trail of Tears and displacement of Native Americans, transferring children from one group to another. When you look at Indian boarding schools in the United States or in Canada or in Australia, you can see that forcibly transferring children to another group is a way to destroying somebody's culture, right? And so before I get too carried away, I'm going to slow down. There are these things called the stages of genocide where we can identify like what, things that lead to extermination. But I would argue that all of these stages are genocide. It's just that because of the failure of linguistics and language and maybe memory, we think of stage 9, the extermination, as being the only part of genocide. But all of this is genocide, and arguably even stage 10. I know it's hard to say this, but I would argue stage 10 is almost worse than stage 9. Like when you're dead, you're dead. But denial is the continuing of genocide. The people who deny the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust happened, aren't they committing the crime over and over again each year and every time they deny it in a way that continues the pain to the victim communities more so than the pain of the people who were killed, because the people who were killed are dead, if that makes sense. So I'm going to stop foaming at the mouth for a second and pause for, questions if you have any.
Well, I had brought up in chat about how many does it take to be labeled a genocide, even if you're killing people.
Yeah. And I
But,
apologize. I can see the chat is full, but I have not been following it. That's one of those good questions, but I don't like it. I like you, just don't like your question. Because and this is a really important term when it comes to genocide studies, is when we start asking that question, and it leads us down the path of what becomes competitive victimization. And that the idea that my genocide is worse than your genocides, right? Like,
yeah,
think about how horrible that is, right?
yeah.
So
Like, for example, because I had a quote from Stalin in there too: the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of millions is a statistic. Who is also a man that in our history, which, like you said, that starts creating that competition of that victimness. So like Stalin killed like 3 times as many people as Hitler.
Yeah. And yet, one of the other factors, and it's in your module for this week, because I'm the one that wrote the module for this week, but there's a quick little video, I think it's about 5 minutes long, maybe 7 minutes long, where I outline the unveiling of international law as it relates to genocide. And so one of the key concepts in the evolution of international law is the idea of sovereignty and sovereign immunity, because the reason Hitler was bad was because he killed people outside of his country. Nobody went to war for the Jews and the Roma and the homosexual community, the communists, or for the physically or mentally challenged people. Nobody went to war to protect those people and stop Adolf Hitler when he started it in 1933. People didn't go to war until 1939, when Hitler started doing it to people in another country, specifically Poland. Nobody went to war to stop the US government from murdering millions of Native Americans. Nobody cares if you murder your own people. People care if you murder other people's people. Now, that is changing in today's world to a degree, but at the same time, the Burmese government is murdering the Rohingya people and nobody's doing anything. The Chinese government is murdering the people, the protesters in Hong Kong and the people in the Uyghur provinces in the western parts of China. Nobody cares. Right? Like, people only step up when the boundaries are crossed, with certain exceptions. And that's the problem, is like Stalin was primarily killing mostly his own people. And so nobody cares. Interesting. Here's another definition, by the way. When they wrote that definition of genocide in the 1940s, it was after World War II. I said that there are 5 definitions, and you saw them listed on the PowerPoint, A, B, C, D, E. There was actually an F definition. Who wants to know what the F definition was that got edited out?
I do.
The definition was murder and incarceration for political ideology. When they were voting on it in the United Nations, I don't know how much you guys know about international law, but there are 5 countries that are called the P5 or the Permanent 5, and those 5 countries have veto power over any law that comes out of the United Nations. Take a wild guess who the P5 are. America. Britain.
Russia.
Russia.
France.
You guys are 3 for 3. Everybody gets the 4th one wrong, by the way. Huh?
France.
That's the one people usually forget, because they were a power then, even if they're not really anymore. And the 5th one is China. So the 5 are Britain, the United States, Russia, China, and France. They can veto any law. When it came to vote on the bill, Stalin, who was the leader of Russia at the time, said he would veto the bill that defined genocide if we included political ideology in the definition. Walk with me down this path, if you will. If Uncle Joe Stalin thinks something's bad, chances are it's actually probably pretty good.
I mean, generally, yeah.
It's a safer bet, right? Like, you
Yeah.
don't want to go down the other path of going, well, Joe Stalin said it, so it must be true.
Yeah.
Right? So I would suggest to you that maybe we should revisit the definition of genocide when it comes to gender, sexuality, and maybe political ideology as well. What's going on in North Korea, what Stalin did, but even today in 2021, what's going on in North Korea, where people are being imprisoned for ideological reasons. So although it's better now than it was for decades, you could include Cuba there too, in terms of political persecution. You could include the British in Northern Ireland.
Tom, when did we human beings, nations, first start to think in terms of justifying interfering what other countries were doing within their own boundaries, within their own?
I'm glad you asked that question, Nick. So the rule that says you can't mess with another country within their boundaries is called the Peace of Westphalia. And I believe I want to say it's like 1538, but I could be off by a couple of years. So in 1538, when they ended one of the wars of German religion, they wrote this peace treaty called Westphalia, where they said, and the Augsburg had a similar line in it, the Peace of Augsburg, and it's his religion, his rule. And basically, it was an agreement that you stay out of the internal business of other countries. The problem with staying out of the business of internal policies of other countries is then other countries can do whatever they want to their own domestic populations. And again, using Native Americans or the enslavement of West Africans in the United States as an example, or what the British did to the Irish as an example, and so on and so forth. And again, to point out that nobody cared what Hitler was doing from 1933 until 1939. It is a willful mismemory of history to pretend we care. We don't care. That started to change a little bit, Nick, to answer your question. One of the first laws of war is known as the Lieber Code. It was written during the Lincoln administration during the US Civil War. You later have, over the next couple of decades, you have the development of the original Geneva Conventions. But the problem is always victor's justice, okay? If you take the US Civil War as an example, do you know how many people were executed for war crimes? 1. Do you think he was on the North or the South?
The South.
He's on the South because the North won. At the end of World War II, we have this famous Nuremberg trial where we put the Nazis on trial. Are you telling me, Brian, you're a veteran? Are you telling me, Brian, that in the 11 major conflicts and decades and decades and decades of war, no American soldier has ever broken the codes of war?
Oh, no, never.
No, never.
No, we got the ANA to do it.
Right.
It's
So
to their own
we
people.
don't put our own people on trial. And even when we do, it has to be a big deal. You know, in Vietnam, there was My Lai, where they put the officers on trial, but they let the soldiers go. And then in Iraq, we have Abu Ghraib, where we let the officers go and we put the grunts on trial. And so there's this problem of victor's justice and the unequal application of law. If it's a war crime and if it's genocide, then you should be persecuted under the international regimes. Today, it's called the ICC, no matter what your nationality is. And that's one of those other problems. And then to believe it or not, Nick, I'm still trying to answer your question. I just get excited. That it really, at the end of World War I, we have what's called the Leipzig trials, where the new German government, the Weimar Republic, put on trial the people of the Kaiser's government. And that was a major step in the international development of law. And then finally, it's really Nuremberg, Nick, is the answer to your question. So that at Nuremberg, the West, and the Western allies and Russia put Germans on trial for what they did, even to their own people, in addition to what they did to other peoples. The US replicated that with what's called the Tokyo trials, what we did to the Japanese imperial government. And then we pretty much did nothing for several decades because of the Cold War, and in the idea of holding people accountable to even the treatment of their internal populations came out in 1994, which is called the ICTY and the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. And today it's called the ICC, the International Criminal Court.
Wow, thank you.
Can you see me foaming? Am I going and like I'm screaming at you? I'm getting so excited.
You are remarkably controlled.
No, said nobody to Tom Keefe ever.
Hey, Tom, can I just interrupt for a second there?
Of course.
Something that I always hated about the argument of Nazi genocide was if we had cameras back then that were reliable, then there would have been no genocide. We have so many cameras today in so many places. Right now in China, we have more than enough proof to convict them of basically, as we're saying, genocide.
They're building the camps right now.
Yes, they have.
You have the satellite imagery of the camps that they're building.
We already have.
Maybe they won't do it.
They literally already have concentration camps and are getting minorities into them, and we said, oh no, if we had cameras it wouldn't happen. No, it's happening. We have cameras, we just don't care. And
I even resent the original statement you made, because there were people who knew what was happening in Germany and we just pretended we didn't know. We chose to say we didn't know.
It's just horrible.
There was a German ship. There was a German, sorry, Brian, real quick. There was a German passenger ship with 400 Jews on it that escaped the Nazi government in like 1936, 1937. They got on this ship, Jewish Germans, and they sailed to the United States, and they were off the coast of North Carolina, and the US government turned the ship around and sent Jews back to Germany.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brian.
I was gonna say my Oma, because my mother's from Austria. So my Oma was in the Nazi army as a Morse code operator in some base or something. But from what she said is that like you could tell things. I mean, it was very prevalent, like you're saying, like how bad things are. I mean, Germans were shooting Germans for any sign of dissension at all, and were justified in doing so. And she eventually met the love of her life and ran away to the mountains to get away from the Nazi army. And
I love that movie they made about your family, The Sound of Music. Your grandmother is Maria.
I mean, I don't know if my Oma could sing, so I don't know if it had that much, but
yeah, one of the stages of genocide, and I'd be happy to go through it in more detail if you guys want, or actually I have a video presentation I could share and leave with you guys. One of the stages of genocide is the polarization. You get rid of the moderates in both groups, and so whenever you have hyperbolic language. And when we look at what this country's been through, and particularly the last year, if not longer, look at that hyperbolic language. Like anybody who, is going after civil rights protesters by saying that they're all terrorists. Like you got to watch out for those terms that are all encompassing. That they're all terrorists, right? That's that hyperbolic language that is it's rhetoric intended to divide communities and to make moderates have to take a side, and that's what the Nazis did. That's what the Hutu government did. That's what the Chinese government today. Jesus was saying, like, hey, the Chinese government's argument is that they're not violating human rights and they're not committing genocide, that they're upholding law and order in Hong Kong, and they're fighting Muslim terrorists in the Uyghur province.
they're saying that the Falun Gong, a religious group that is proficient in meditating and finding inner peace, is terrorists.
It's terrifying, the idea of inner peace. I think that's what's threatening the government, right?
Yeah. Oh no, they're going to parks and exercising. Oh
Mhm.
no, we have to stop that.
Yeah.
Oh, not only
Honest-
that, let's harvest their organs. That'll show them.
Wait, that doesn't make any logical sense. If you hate somebody, why would you want their organs?
If the reason for American slavery was that it was okay because West Africans weren't human, then how come our founding fathers all had black mistresses and fathered children with them if they weren't human?
Yeah.
None of it makes sense.
None of it.
The issue is that I was thinking things were rational.
That was, excuse me, stupid of you.
Yes.
Thank you. You know, I keep thinking of it's the reason we all are objecting and why we say we don't care. Care begins where, which has to be argued carefully. I get it. But it's, let me put it this way. If I justify, or if and when I justify taking your life, I know deep down inside, wherever the hell that is, that I justify someone taking my life, to put it selfishly. And that's okay to do so. It seems to me in this situation, there is something in us that knows. We don't know everything. We don't know everything. We're not going to agree on everything. That's what particular act is right or wrong. But there is something biological going on here in which we know we have to be very careful in attempting to justify it, whether we're justifying it religiously or politically or whatever the case. So there is something in us. And we might even say that it's universally human, and it's related to legitimate self-defense. We have to be, we want to think and feel very carefully about it. But we allow our, shall I say, natural moral sensibilities to be overwhelmed by social and political power, by the notion that might is right, and craziness like that. Once I justify dominating you, I also inadvertently justify you dominating me. And the only thing that protects me from that is that I must struggle to keep dominating you. There's something going on here. Say, Tom.
I was just getting, which leads to genocide, right? Because if you walk that path that you're talking about, it does become logical to commit genocide, because if you are doing to somebody else something which they might do to you, then you better kill them before they kill you.
On the subject of polarization, I see a lot of posts online talking about class genocide. And I was wondering if you had any ideas about that.
What does that mean? What do you understand that to mean?
That lower class citizens are being basically worked to death.
Yeah. Oh, that's written right into good capitalist values, at least unregulated. Good.
I struggle, Morgan, and depending on the day of the week, you'd get a different answer from me. But
yeah,
there's no doubt in my mind that what happened to Indigenous Americans was genocide. I struggle with classifying what happened to West Africans as genocide, because the goal was a controlled workforce that could be exploited for the economic benefits of middle class and wealthy whites. And that's not the same as the goal of extermination, right? Like that the thousands of African Americans that were murdered under Jim Crow and in slavery, the goal wasn't to kill them. The goal was to intimidate the others that were not killed into subservience. Is that it, to a degree? I know it's controversial what I'm saying, and I could take the other argument too, but from that perspective, if you buy what I'm saying to differentiate what happened to West Africans in the institution of slavery and Jim Crow versus what happened to Indigenous Americans, then what's happening to the what is called the permanent poor, these are economic terms, not my terms, the permanent poor and the working poor and the working class, depending on how many rungs of society you have, those are the three lower groups in terms of economic power. That the people who are depriving those people of their ability to improve their living condition, the goal isn't to kill them. The goal is to control them and manipulate them. And through waving red meat, like the American flag, or racial divisions, or that somehow the idea that the government providing you with healthcare is offensive, right? And we see this. It's the strategy of the Roman Empire, right? Bread and circuses. Instead of having the Colosseum, nowadays we have the NFL and we have food stamps. Because what do we do with Medicaid and food stamps? We give just enough that they don't die, but not enough to help them thrive. Because if we were to cut off SNAP and Medicaid, there would be a revolution in this country because people would be dying. So the powers that be don't want the permanent poor, the working poor, or the working class. They don't want them to die. They want them to be addicted. They want them to be sick. They want them to be uneducated, but they don't want them to die, in my opinion, if that makes a little sense.
Make good sense.
Is it because we're not allowed to talk about serious things that it's depressing?
We don't like that. We don't like the pain. I think we don't like the guilt.
That I think it's more the guilt and the responsibility, Nick. I think because once you start going down that road about other people in governments, it is really, and Jesus, I'm not picking on you. You and I were both talking about China, but it's really easy as Americans to pick on China, North Korea, Cuba, what have you. How come the United States didn't stop what the British were doing in Northern Ireland during the Troubles for almost 40 years? The Democrats and Republican presidents would just say, well, that's internal policy of Britain. Why do we not talk about slavery in the United States? Why do we not talk about the Indigenous Americans? There's an issue of responsibility and guilt, and when that conversation opens up, Brian and Nick, like you've both heard this expression, well, the United States can't be the world's policeman.
Yeah.
Because the United States has no problem doing what it wants in the world when it wants something.
Thank you.
But it's when there might be responsibility that we hide behind issues of sovereignty and so forth. And
yeah,
think
we're
we're
here
too
to
divided.
protect and help you. Oh, look, oil! What a coincidence! I'll just take that.
hey, let me show you this picture, and don't overthink here. Certainly don't cheat. No cheating allowed. Anybody know who that is? This is a kid from Denver. He was a 14-year-old kid from Denver. He was a US citizen who was murdered by Barack Obama.
Oh,
Directly. He did it.
Exactly. He was in a restaurant in Yemen visiting his family, and again, a US citizen, and Barack Obama authorized a missile strike on the restaurant.
oh,
It's called due process. It goes back to what Nick said. And it started under Bush, continued under Obama, continued under Trump. It'll probably continue under Biden. This use of extrajudicial authority by the US presidents is exactly what Nick's talking about. If the US presidents can assassinate people overseas outside of the US borders, why can't other countries assassinate Americans inside the United States?
yeah.
Look at that kid's face and remember he was born in Denver, Colorado. And remember that he's dead because he was eating in a restaurant.
Yeah.
Now, his family is connected to the terrorists. That is a fact. There is no evidence that he was connected with the criminal aspects of his family. And if you buy the argument of guilt by association, then we should round up all Italians, Nick, because of the mafia.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's just a pet peeve of mine that a 14-year-old kid was not given his due process rights. And that's the whole idea. And I guess I'll end with my favorite poem. And I know you've all heard it before, but I'll say it again. First, they came for the Jews, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for the communists, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a communist. And then they came for the unionists, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a unionist. And then they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak for me. There's a reason we have to have laws, and there's a reason we have to make sure that the laws apply to everyone. You don't know the character of a country or the character of a person until they stand up for the rights of the people they don't like, and when they prosecute the people they do like. That's all I got.